Well, it's wonderful to have you all here this afternoon. We welcome Stephen Biddle this afternoon. Stephen is professor of the International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. He is also a member at Second, who we look to when the lid of the kettle rumbles on the hot stove of the Middle East. So please welcome Steve.
Yeah, it talks about troubles in the Middle East as kind of a full-time job security sort of position. Will you pray with me? Dear Lord, be with us this afternoon as we delve into some of the issues facing the United States as it once again wages war in this ever so troubled part of the world. Grant us the wisdom to see your will for our country and these issues. Grant us the courage to act on your will. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So I'm especially impressed that this many people came out on a sunny Sunday and 4th of July weekend. That's either deep commitment to public affairs or clinically diagnosable, one or the other. So my marching issues are to provide an update on the Middle East, but I suspect that the aspect of the Middle East people are most interested in is the U.S. role in the Iran-Israel war and the airstrikes that we conducted beginning on June 22nd. So I'm going to spend some time talking about all that and where it's going to go from here and what the policy issues are confronting the United States. But I thought it would be useful to start with a little bit of context on how we got to June 22nd and how we ended up waging war against Iran in a region where the United States has waged war ever so much since 2001. And at risk of sounding like a historian, I want to just briefly, by way of context, go back to the 1979 Iranian Revolution. So as you'll recall, the Shah of Iran is overthrown. Any government that comes to power as usurpists through an overthrow has a legitimacy problem. How do you establish to your population that you have a right to run the place, given that they didn't elect you, you came in through use of force? So the policies that the Iranian theocracy has adopted ever since 1979 for justifying their rule to their own population is by constructing a conflict with outsiders. Sorry? He's having trouble here, and that's why you need closer, that's all. I'm good, I'm good. There are words coming up on the screen. Whatever will they think of next? Modern technology, it can produce all sorts of things, including airstrikes on centrifuge halls, but more on that in a moment. So the Iranian theocracy establishes its legitimacy by creating a conflict with outsiders. Those outsiders have been Israel and the United States. Iran needs that conflict. The government needs that conflict in order to establish the legitimacy of its rule, but it doesn't want an outright war, historically, with either the United States or Israel. What it wants is a pot on simmer, but not on boil. Enough that it can justify to its population poor economic performance, lack of political representation, poor service delivery by arguing it's because of this conflict we've got with these horrible Israelis and the great Satan in the United States. It's not our fault. Right? We're stuck with this because of the nature of this conflict, but they have not historically wanted an acute war that they thought might produce regime change in Tehran, the toppling of their government and the destruction of the project of regime preservation that they've been about since 1979. So they need to have a conflict, but keep it at simmer. How do you keep it at simmer and not persuade the Israelis or the Americans to go to full boil and topple your government? And so the Iranians classically had adopted a two-part deterrent strategy for how they could keep a conflict going, but keep its intensity limited. The first part of that strategy was proxies. So the Iranians have developed, advised, equipped, and funded a series of non-state militias in the countries that border Israel, especially Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, Hamas in the Gaza Strip, and more recently the Yemeni rebellion. Each of them is armed with rockets and missiles that are capable of striking Israel. And the logic is, if Israel decides to attack Iran, Iran's proxies that surround Israel will strike Israeli population centers with rockets and missiles. This will dissuade Israel from attacking Iran directly. That's part number one of the strategy. Part number two of the strategy has been the pursuit of nuclear weapons. Iran's pursuit of nuclear weapons, however, is complicated. Nuclear weapons are a dangerous thing to try and get. If you get them, there's good reason to believe that you will be able to deter people from attacking you by the threat to use nuclear weapons on their population areas if they do. The trouble is, people worry enough about that scenario that the attempt to get nuclear weapons creates an incentive for somebody else to attack you preemptively and destroy the program before it comes to fruition. The way to square that circle of wanting the deterrent but not wanting the preemptive attack in the meantime is often a strategy that people in this business refer to as latency. In nuclear latency, prospective nuclear weapon states get close to getting a bomb and then stop. They don't go all the way there, because they believe that if it's clear that they're going all the way there, they'll invite preemptive attack. But they want to be close enough to there that if there's a conventional war they get stuck in, they can threaten to go the rest of the way in a hurry and get the weapons. So latency is an attempt to have your cake and eat it too, to get the deterrent benefits of a nuclear program without inviting a preemptive attack that will destroy it before it's ready to go. This nuclear deterrent strategy has given rise to tremendous controversy, in recent years, where the U.S. intelligence community has, in recent years, judged that the Iranians were not pursuing a nuclear weapon, and various American conservatives and political officials have said, that's crazy, of course they're pursuing a nuclear weapon. They're doing all these things that are strongly suggestive that they want a nuclear weapon. And both sides are talking past each other. What the intelligence community is saying when they say, we do not assess that the Iranians have decided to get a nuclear weapon, is that the Iranians are at latency. What the political leadership is saying is the Iranians want a nuclear weapon, which is, of course, they do. That's why they've gotten to latency. In an important respect, both of these statements are true. Now, that was kind of where we were until October 7, 2023. Now, one of the problems with the first part of Iran's two-part deterrent strategy is if you're relying on proxies to deter an Israeli attack by the threat of rocket fire and all sorts of other nastiness, the proxies have minds of their own. They have free will. They can act on what they perceive their own interests to be, and their interests and Iran's interests are not literally the same. And Hamas in Gaza on October 7, 2023, launched an attack that the Iranians apparently did not direct and probably did not want. What was going on at the time was that there were negotiations afoot between the Biden administration, the Saudis, and the Israelis over prospective normalization of Israeli-Saudi relations. If those negotiations had gone forward, they basically would have taken the wind out of the sails of the Palestinian movement by removing one of the Palestinians' primary outside backers in the form of the Saudis and the Gulf Arab states generally. To prevent this from happening, Hamas decided it needed to act. Almost certainly that's why they attacked Israel on October 7, 2023, was to prevent Israeli-Saudi normalization, and the attack did that. But the attack did a lot more. In all likelihood, it killed more Israelis and took way more hostages than Hamas had expected or that Iran wanted. And the result of an attack that ended up being far more lethal in all likelihood than Hamas even expected, and certainly than Iran actually wanted, was it spurred the Israelis into an extremely forceful response. in which they launched a full-scale ground invasion and air offensive against Hamas in Gaza, and in the process obliterated the majority of all civilian housing in Gaza, has now killed in excess of 50,000 people, some of whom are Hamas fighters, many of whom are civilians, killed, we estimate, somewhere probably on the order of about 50% of Hamas's combatant strength, and killed much of Hamas's political and military leadership in targeted strikes on individuals. As that campaign was beginning to reach what military analysts might call culmination, when it looked like it was going to achieve about as much as it was going to achieve militarily on the ground in Gaza, the Israelis faced a decision: do we now stop or do we broaden the war and attempt to go after not just the symptoms of the problem as they understood it, these proxies, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis in Yemen, but go after A, other proxies, Hezbollah and the Houthis, and B, the heart of the problem in the form of Tehran. And so the Israelis started opening the aperture and broadening the war, initially by killing a group of Iranian diplomats in the Iranian consulate in Damascus, Syria, in the spring of last year. The Iranians understood this as not just a direct attack, but a deliberate insult, killing their government officials in a neutral location in a diplomatic installation that normally enjoys immunity. That led to a series of tit-for-tat retaliatory airstrikes and counter-retaliatory airstrikes. The Israelis then killed the political leader of Hamas, Ismail Haniyeh, in Tehran, where Haniyeh was conferring with his Iranian backers. And at this point, the Iranians, who, remember, are trying to keep this on simmer and not let it go to boil, are now faced with an Israel that's progressively turning up the temperature on the stove, heading toward a boil, and the Iranians decide we've got to do something to deter this and stop further escalation, or else it's going to get out of control, and they launch a major air attack on Israel, which is remarkably ineffective. The Israelis and the United States and the British and the French and the Jordanians combine to defend Israeli airspace from an attack of over 100 drones and missiles, shoot down the great majority of them. At that point, Iran says, okay, we've done our bit. We've signaled that we're serious. Let's stop the escalatory process right here and not take this any further. The Israelis, on the other hand, are not willing to stop there. So Israel then proceeds somewhat later in the year to launch a war in a much more forceful way than they had previously against Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, one of the other of Iran's major proxy forces. The way they do this is they get intelligence information suggesting that Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, believes that Israel has compromised the cell phone communications that Hezbollah leadership is using to communicate with each other, and therefore we, Hezbollah, need to re-equip, get rid of cell phones, and instead use the simpler, older technology of pagers, which it is thought would be immune from Israeli penetration. Israel gets wind of this, sets up a shell company, manufactures the pagers that will be sold to Hezbollah, and manufactures them with several grams of high explosive in each pager that can be triggered remotely by an electronic broadcast transmission, waits for these to be distributed to the entire Hezbollah political and military leadership, and then either because they think the time is right because the operation in Gaza has kind of stabilized, or whether they think it's a use or lose problem because the fact that their pagers are compromised is about to be given away. For whatever reason, in September, Israel pulls the trigger, sends the broadcast message, blows up pagers in the hundreds and thousands and wipes out a sizable fraction of Hezbollah's military and political leadership. A couple of weeks later, Israel launches a ground invasion of South Lebanon and a massive program of airstrikes throughout Lebanon, not just the south where Hezbollah is mostly militarily operational, but throughout the country and including the capital in Beirut. Those airstrikes eventually kill Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah. So Israel now removes the entire military and political leadership of Hezbollah, reoccupies southern Lebanon, waits a couple of weeks, and then decides to expand the campaign again and launches a series of airstrikes against metropolitan Iran. In October of last year, aimed largely at air defense and military targets, but excluding the Iranian nuclear system. Those Israeli airstrikes in October of last year essentially destroyed the Iranian air defense system almost in its entirety, at very little loss to the Israelis themselves. And then they stopped. And things proceeded in a condition of relative quiet until June of this year. Now, what Bibi Netanyahu in Israel is calculating during this period is, what are my opportunities and what are my risks if I go any further than simply destroying the Iranian air defense system and clearing the way for the Israeli Air Force to attack Iran and go further to some larger goal? Destroying the Iranian nuclear program, latent but not full scale, toppling the Iranian regime. The dilemma Israel faces at this point is, if they try to topple the regime, A, it's hard to do from the air from hundreds of miles away, but B, if you do it, who would replace them? Many Israelis believe that anybody would be better, and therefore they're okay with regime change, but the general expectation is that if the Iranian regime fell, the result would not be George Washington with a funny accent and blossoming of pluralistic democracy in Tehran, but probably chaos, because there is no organized Iranian resistance that you could expect to simply take over. The likelihood would be ongoing chronic civil warfare in Iran. That might or might not be better than what they have now, but it doesn't look ideal. Alternatively, Israel could go after the Iranian nuclear system. The problem is the Israeli Air Force isn't capable of destroying the Iranian nuclear system. Parts of it are relatively accessible to the Israeli Air Force. Other parts are buried deep in mountains. And especially, the Iranians had developed a critical part of the system for building nuclear weapons deep under a mountain in Fordo that the Israelis had no ability to destroy. If they didn't destroy it, they would leave an important part of the Iranian nuclear capability intact. If they attack Iran's nuclear system, they run the risk of persuading a latent Iran to make a sprint for full nuclear capability that they can't prevent because important parts of the Iranian target system are too tough for their Air Force to penetrate. If they attack the Iranian nuclear system, the logic of the strike is they will somehow or another chain gang the United States into joining them in the campaign. Because the belief is that unlike the Israeli Air Force, the US Air Force has the capacity, it was hoped, to destroy deeply buried targets like Fordo and finish the job. Netanyahu decides by June of this year to roll the cosmic dice and attempt this airstrike program, but without a clear objective. It's neither sufficient in itself to destroy the Iranian nuclear system, nor is it targeted in such a way as to maximize the likelihood of regime change. It destroys a bunch of targets, incurs no losses because the Iranians have no remaining air defense system, but has no way to end the war. Netanyahu then calls up Donald Trump, tries to persuade him to join the war. Trump faces a dilemma in that a significant part of his domestic political coalition wants no part of endless wars in the Middle East. On the other hand, part of this problem is whispering in his other ear, the Israelis have just wiped out the Iranian air defense system. They can strike anything they want to strike. They're winning this war. Do you want to be left standing on the sidelines while Bibi Netanyahu gets all the credit for defeating Iran? So the issues are going back and forth. Trump eventually decides to join the war. We get the June 22 airstrikes by the United States in which we attack the deeply buried centrifuge hull under the mountain at Fordo. We attack the less well-defended centrifuge installation at Natanz, and we strike another important element of the system, the uranium conversion facility in Isfahan. And that's pretty much where we are now. The debate right now is going back and forth about how much damage even the U.S. was able to inflict. Depending on who you talk to, estimates are somewhere between damage to the Iranian system that will delay a sprint to nuclear weapons if the Iranians choose it by months, or damage to the Iranian nuclear system that will delay a sprint to nuclear weapons if the Iranians are choosing it by a couple of years. So now the issue is where from here? And the where from here question has different answers for the different actors. So starting with the Iranians are in a horrible position. The fundamental logic of the self-preservation strategy they've adopted ever since 1979 is now in ruins. Hezbollah has been crippled. Hamas has been crippled. Their two primary proxies are no longer viable as deterrents to the Israelis. And the basic logic of latency, that if you get close but don't go all the way, you'll deter an attack and won't be struck preemptively, is also in tatters. They were struck preemptively. Being latent but not nuclear apparently is not sufficient to deter preemptive attack, because they just got preemptively attacked. So what can they do now, given that regime preservation is still their primary goal? And none of the options open to them are any good. They could just do nothing. Chuck Freilich, former Deputy National Security Advisor to the State of Israel, has described this as a policy of malign neglect. Don't strike back. Don't sprint to nuclear weapons. Just pretend like nothing happened and go on. The risk in that policy is popular uprising that creates regime overthrow. The Iranians have been worried about this ever since 1979. And in 2009 and 2022, there were major uprisings in the streets, even without an Israeli attack, that threatened the viability of the regime and had to be put down by violent repressive force. The central concern of the mullahs in Tehran right now is probably to avert a popular uprising that would overthrow their regime. Doing nothing advertises their weakness, advertises that they've wasted 2 generations of economic growth, physical capital, human capital in the pursuit of a deterrent strategy that failed and wasn't worth anything. If they simply do nothing in the face of all this, it's likely that the Iranian regime will conclude that they will probably be overthrown. Therefore, it's far from obvious that doing nothing is that great a strategy. Or they could attempt to escalate, pull a rabbit out of the hat, and turn around their fate and fortune in this war. The trouble is all the escalatory options look terrible. The capacity of the Iranian military has turned out, when push came to shove, to be way less threatening than military experts anywhere had expected as recently as 2 years ago. I think very few people expected that the Israeli Air Force was going to be able to destroy the Iranian air defense system at 0 loss to any piloted aircraft. But they are. I don't think anybody a couple of years ago thought that Israel could wipe out the leadership group of Hamas and Hezbollah, and yet they did. So, yeah, I mean, Iran has the physical capacity to attack U.S. bases in the region. It has the physical capacity to continue launching missiles at Israel from metropolitan Iran. It has the physical capacity to close the Straits of Hormuz. It has the physical capacity to attack the Saudi oil infrastructure. But all of these things invite further military action from Israel and the United States, to which Iran has no answer. They could kill some additional Israelis, they could kill some Americans, they could kill some Saudis, but they would probably be inviting the military campaign that they've been trying to deter ever since 1979, and that really could lead to regime change. So that doesn't look like a great option. If conventional attacks in the region don't look great, if doing nothing doesn't look great, that leaves sprint to full nuclear weapons capability. Now, at the moment, we don't know what they're going to choose, and I don't think they've made up their own mind yet. But there are initial indications that they may be choosing option number 3 and a sprint to full nuclear capability. So, back in the Obama administration, there was a negotiated agreement between the United States, a group of other great powers in Iran, called the JCPOA, the world's worst acronym candidate, which stands for the Joint Common Plan of Action, in which Iran agreed to substantially reduce its stockpile of enriched uranium, cap and limit their progress towards nuclear weapons in exchange for, and allow inspectors into the country in exchange for a lifting of sanctions that had been imposed on Iran because of its nuclear program by the West. So they agreed to this deal, and it had a 15-year sunset provision to it. The deal holds for 15 years. At the end of 15 years, all provisions are off. The Trump administration, when it took office in 2016, looked at this thing negotiated by the Obama administration and said, this was a lousy deal. We can do better. We can get better terms than that. And they tore it up and withdrew from it unilaterally, reinstituted sanctions, and pursued a more aggressive deal, which they never got. The Iranians continued to observe the terms of the JCPOA for about a year, concluded that the Trump administration really was serious, the deal was no more, and withdrew entirely, but the inspectors continued. The inspection provisions of the JCPOA, in which representatives of the International Atomic Energy Agency would be on the ground in Iran, poking around in their nuclear facilities and observing what was going on, continued. Therefore, we had some, albeit limited, window into what the Iranian nuclear program was like on the ground, because we had these people from the IAEA snooping around and checking what the centrifuges were doing and figuring out how much enriched uranium the Iranians had. And that persisted up to a couple of weeks ago, when the Iranians kicked them all out and said no more access. That's a potential indicator that the Iranians may have made the decision, or at least actively considering a decision, to sprint to nuclear capability as fast as they can get it, whether that's a couple of months or a couple of years, depending on who you talk to. They may have made the call to go all the way and get a capability for a usable bomb. We don't know. Depending on how good they are at concealing this, we may not know until a weapon goes off. Now, their nuclear system is pretty heavily penetrated by the Israelis. Part of why Israel was so successful in its attack on Iran is that the primary Israeli foreign intelligence agency, the Mossad, had deeply penetrated the entire Iranian military and civil leadership group. Maybe Mossad knows what's going on and either knows that they've decided not to do it or knows where the hidden targets are that we haven't destroyed yet if they do decide to do it. I don't think anybody in the U.S., certainly outside the U.S. government, knows. But if the Iranians take that route, that will either produce a nuclear weapon in months to years, long before they would have gotten one under the JCPOA, by the way. Right, the delay we've imposed on the Iranian nuclear program by blowing stuff up is significantly shorter in even the most optimistic assessment than the delay the Iranians had agreed to under the JCPOA, which the Trump administration tore up. But anyway, depending on what happens, if they take that route, maybe we'll discover it and find the targets and have to go back and strike it again, which will delay it for a few more months to a few more years. If they then rebuild it, we'll have to go back again and again, right? And this process, in principle, can repeat for an indefinite period of time. If you're worried about forever wars in the Middle East, right, if the Iranians are prepared to reconstruct the program, albeit at expense and risk, we could be at war with the Iranians for quite some time. The Trump administration, I think, is hopeful that they can negotiate a deal at this point, where the Iranians go back to a more aggressive version of the JCPOA, choose to forego their nuclear program in exchange for the end of sanctions. So far, there's no indication the Iranians are interested in the negotiation. But that's where we stand right now, and in terms of what's likely to happen in the immediate future, the Iranians have nothing but bad options. There's some indication that they may have made the decision to sprint to a full nuclear capability. If they do, there will either be a bomb or we'll restrike if we can find the targets before they develop a full capability. Now, let me wrap up the transmit phase of this before we go to Q&A by evaluating Israeli policy and U.S. policy as well as Iranian policy. Right? So I've made the argument that Iran's strategy has basically failed. You could make the argument that it was never a particularly good idea because of the amount of diversion from wealth creation that it involved and the degree of suffering that it created in periodic low-level conflicts between Israel and proxies. But at least until recently, it had done what the Iranians wanted it to do. It had maintained a low simmer and kept their regime intact. Doesn't look now like it was successful ultimately. What about Israel? Bibi Netanyahu's polls right now are stratospheric. He is more popular in Israel right now than he has ever been. The general perception globally has been that the Israelis have won the war. They've denatured Hamas. They've denatured Hezbollah. They've at least set back the Iranian nuclear program, all at radically low cost to Israel, at least since the October 7 attacks. The Iranian conventional missile attacks on Israel after Israel started the war in January have killed probably around 30 Israeli civilians, injured another 1,000 or so, made perhaps 10,000 Israelis homeless. But by comparison with the scale of suffering in Gaza or the scale of suffering in Tehran, the cost to Israel of setting back the Iranian nuclear program has been significantly lower. Does this represent policy success by the Israelis? And to evaluate this, it's important to bring in the concept and strategic studies of the levels of war. So you'll pardon me for being slightly pedantic for a moment. People who study strategy often distinguish between tactics, operations, and strategy. Where tactics are the conduct of battles or airstrikes or raids, operations is the use of multiple battles or airstrikes or raids to win a military campaign. Strategy is the use of multiple military campaigns together with political, diplomatic, and economic policies to bring about the ultimate interests of the state. At the tactical level, Israel has been tremendously successful. Their performance in these battles and airstrikes and raids has been way better than anybody would have reasonably expected. At the strategic level, performance has been much less successful. After all, the purpose of strategy is to meet the political interests of the state. What are Israel's political interests towards Gaza and Iran? Netanyahu has never articulated any. The Israeli government has never identified its war aims in Gaza other than to destroy Hamas, which is impossible. No one, including the Israeli government, believes you can literally kill every last member of Hamas. So far, they've killed maybe half, plenty of the leadership, but Hamas remains alive, viable, and in control of significant parts of the Gaza Strip. Part of the problem with aid distribution right now is Hamas remains to this day sufficiently viable in Gaza that they can control who gets the aid and who doesn't unless somebody shows up with guns to distribute the aid in a way that people other than Hamas wants. And that's created chaos in aid delivery within the Gaza Strip because Hamas is not destroyed. They've been crippled. Their ability to launch rockets into Israel has gone to zero, but they remain the predominant political actor in Gaza. So is Israel's strategic objective in Gaza to remove Hamas as the leadership authority? If so, the war has not succeeded because Hamas is still in charge. If Israel's goal in Gaza is to replace Hamas with some other government that won't be an enemy of Israel, then the tactics Israel has been using make that strategic goal less likely to be achieved and not more. The only viable alternative to Hamas in running Gaza is probably some variation on the Palestinian Authority that's ruling in the West Bank of the Jordan. The Biden administration had been aggressively negotiating for the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Jordanians, and the Egyptians to support a revitalized Palestinian Authority, which would be put in charge in Gaza after Hamas had been weakened and would then be given the reconstruction aid necessary to rebuild the Strip and create viable, putatively legitimate governance. And Netanyahu had vetoed that program throughout the Biden years. Netanyahu deliberately prevented it from going forward, and the tactics they were using in Gaza made it politically impossible for the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Egyptians and the Jordanians to go through with it, even if Netanyahu hadn't vetoed it, because the populations in all these countries believed that Israel was engaged in genocide towards Arab Palestinians and would have risen up in the street and thrown out their own government if it had appeared to support an Israeli project in Gaza. If Israel's strategic objective in Gaza is a government in Gaza that won't attack Israel, you can't use force tactically in ways that create this kind of devastation in Gaza because you make it impossible to create a new government there that can pursue your political objective and end the war. Against Hezbollah, Israel's political objective is also unstated. Maybe it's to replace Hezbollah with some alternative political actor in southern Lebanon that wouldn't see Israel as an enemy. If that's your plan, who is that going to be? The only plausible candidate is the government of Lebanon. If that's the idea, Israel ought to be training, equipping, advising, and assisting the Lebanese National Army to take over South Lebanon in a way that would prevent Hezbollah from re-infiltrating, and yet the Israelis have actually been targeting the government's forces in South Lebanon. And they've certainly not been helping them or assisting them. We talked earlier about the problem of Israel's objectives towards Iran. Is it regime change? If so, why only do a halfway job of it? The regime isn't buried in a mountain in Fordo. They could have killed the Ayatollah if they had wanted to. They held back. Is it to prevent the Iranians from getting nuclear weapons? You may just have accelerated the process. So Israel has been extraordinarily talented and proficient at the tactical level of war, and so far, the connection between tactical success and strategic purpose has been absent. Then there's the United States. What's our objective in all this? Our objective in all this had been midwife a political solution in which you get a government in Gaza and a government in Lebanon that doesn't aim for the destruction of Israel anymore. That isn't going anywhere. We don't want the Iranians to have a nuclear program. We assisted the Israelis militarily in an attempt to pursue that goal, and that effort may very well have accelerated the process. If what we wanted was to prevent the Iranians from getting a nuclear weapon, you could make a very good argument that the more efficient way to do that would be don't have torn up the JCPOA back in 2020 or 2016. So anyway, you look at all three of these actors, Iran, Israel, and the United States. Israel and the United States have performed way above expectations tactically, but not strategically. The Iranians have performed poorly at both the tactical and the strategic level. And there's a serious danger that failure by all three of these parties to realize strategic objectives for ending wars on terms that they can live with could very well end up creating a generation of suffering in the region. Maybe if we're lucky, who knows? The mullahs may decide to take the risk of a popular uprising, not acquire nuclear weapons, pursue political openings, democratization, and an opening of the economy, hope that the result of all that is that the people accept their rule rather than throwing their rule out. That could happen. Or Iran could end up with a nuclear weapon as a result of all this. And at the moment, we don't know which way we're going to go. But for Iran to democratize in the way the United States wants would require a fundamental 180 from the direction that the Iranian regime had thought they had to take for their own survival ever since 1979. We'll find out over the course of coming months and years whether they decide to take that risk or not, and if they take it, whether it works. I've talked longer than is a good idea. So why don't I stop and we can talk about what you folks want to talk about. So let's go to questions, and we apparently have a microphone.
Well, we have two. We're going to ask you to use this one first if we can. If you can't get to this microphone, I have one that I'm happy to use. You do not have to touch the microphones. You don't have to turn them on and off. Steve, who I very much appreciate, is here out of the goodness of his heart and because he always likes to hear Dr. Biddle speak. So he is here running sound. He'll take care of the microphones. You just need to hold them close enough that he can get the sound, okay? So speak here first with questions, but if you can't get to it, I'm happy to.
Okay, the floor is open. I've sufficiently deterred questions by the threat of nuclear weapon use. Yes?
We've talked about Iran and Israel and their proxies. And we saw Trump go ahead and bomb this nuclear place. I've also heard that in the beginning days, when Trump was campaigning, he didn't have much confidence or likeness to our intelligence service. So, what are the possibilities that Iran can get terrorists into the United States, low under our intelligence service, bring a dirty bomb, and set it off in a place? What's that possibility?
Okay. Excellent question. Two different dimensions to it that I'll pick up. One is this business of dirty bombs, and the other is the question of can the Iranians infiltrate terrorists into the United States and carry out attacks of whatever kind? Dirty bombs, assault rifles, whatever. It turns out it's a lot harder to infiltrate terrorists into the United States than people imagined back in 2001, partly as a result of massive counter-terrorist efforts in the United States since 2001. There have been nothing remotely like the 9/11 attacks ever since. And it's not because al-Qaeda were nice people who didn't harbor ill intent towards us. It's because they haven't been able to. Border controls, internal surveillance, monitoring by the FBI and tipsters in the general public, it turns out, are pretty effective at identifying foreign terrorists within the United States. And so there have been no major terrorist attacks since then. There have been smallish ones. On average, about 6 Americans a year have been killed by international terrorists since 2001. But it's a pretty small number. And again, it's not for lack of trying. The Iranians tried very hard to assassinate Donald Trump and to assassinate Trump's first-term Secretary of State. They haven't succeeded. But again, it's not for lack of trying. So I'm sure the Iranians would very much like to have the option of domestic terrorism in the United States. But my guess is the prognosis for the Iranians causing significant casualties to Americans is lower domestically in the United States than it is for our base structure in the region. And even against our base structure in the region, they've showed very limited ability to inflict casualties. That raises this issue of dirty bombs. Right? So as I'm sure you know, the idea with the dirty bomb is to take radioactive material that isn't at critical mass. It doesn't have a sufficient quantity and density to sustain a chain reaction and cause an explosion. But it would be radioactive in ways that would create health risks for individuals close to it. Dirty bombs, by and large, are scare tactics. It is exceptionally difficult to kill people with dirty bombs. Uranium, which is the metal that people talk about the most in this context, that's probably not the most viable dirty bomb mechanism, is one of the hardest metals known to humanity. The United States Army uses depleted uranium as the basis of our primary anti-tank munitions because it is one of the hardest, densest metals known. To create a dirty bomb where some cloud of irradiated material is floating around means taking a bar of one of the hardest metals known to humanity and vaporizing it. And that, it turns out, is extraordinarily hard to do. So, I mean, the better plans for dirty bombing are usually medical imaging materials. Cesium, iridium, other things that are used to facilitate radiologists' work, and scattering that stuff around. But the level of radiation you can create that way is tiny. So basically what dirty bombs amount to is the hope that if in 10 locations around Midtown Manhattan you set off a small explosive, let people know that it's uranium or it's radioactive, and hope that you'll panic people into killing each other on subway stairways as they try and flee the tunnels. Because the actual morbidity and mortality associated with the material itself will be negligible. So dirty bombs I'm not too worried about. A related issue would be an unsophisticated nuclear weapon. So we talked about centrifuges and enrichment just a little bit earlier. If other hands don't go up, you're at risk of having me talk more about nuclear proliferation technology. So I will continue doing that until somebody stops me. So to make a nuclear weapon, you need fissionable material in a critical mass. these wooden pews are not made of fissionable material. Fissionable, and fortunately so, right? Fissionable material has the unique quality that when an atom of it is struck by a neutron, that atom splits. The split pieces hit other atoms which split. They then split, and this goes up in a multiplicative way, releasing energy at each step, and you get an explosion. Most materials are not fissionable. They don't split, their atoms don't split when they're hit with neutrons. So you need something that's fissionable, and it turns out that uranium has this potential. But even uranium, as you find it in nature, isn't fissionable. Uranium comes in two flavors, two isotopes, two versions with different molecular weight. Uranium-238, which is not fissionable, and uranium-235, which is. Naturally occurring uranium has less than 0.72% of it in the U-235 flavor. The vast majority of naturally occurring uranium is non-fissionable U-238, which again is fortunate. If all natural uranium were mostly U-235, the planet would have blown up a long time ago, none of us would be here. So if you want to make a bomb, somehow you've got to take uranium that has a tiny fraction of fissionable isotope within it and enrich it to ideally from 0.72% U-235 up to 90%. And that's what the enrichment process and all these centrifuges in places like Fordow are trying to do. If you don't get, this is a difficult industrial process, hard to do, expensive, relatively slow. What if you don't get all the way to 90%? What if you just enrich it to, say, 60%? The Iranians have several hundred pounds of uranium that's already been enriched to 60%. Not ideal for a bomb, but a lot higher than naturally occurring uranium and a lot higher than what you would put in a reactor. Most reactors use uranium that's been enriched to about 3% U-235. Well, you could create a crude nuclear weapon that would actually create an explosion. It just wouldn't have the ideal yield and military properties. But the Iranians probably already have enough uranium enriched to 60% that they could make a crude bomb, put it in a container, put it on a container ship, and sail it into Newark Harbor. Set it off in Newark Harbor, and do horrible things to my apartment on the Upper West Side. I would put that as a higher concern than a dirty bomb, and it's something the Iranians could probably do right now, or at least soon. There are other steps they would have to follow, and if people are curious, we can talk about what those would be. So anyway, domestic terrorism in the U.S. is harder than it sounds. And dirty bombs are particularly hard if you actually are intending to kill a lot of people. Sorry?
What if the tactic was not to kill masses of people, but small group of people?
Mm-hmm. Well, and
small group of military people.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, terrorism has often been described as the attempt to kill a few people and frighten a lot of people. And the terrorist actions that have happened since 2001 have typically been small-scale lone wolf activities where the ready availability of assault weapons in the United States makes it possible for a lone wolf individual to buy an assault rifle and use it in a crowded area and kill potentially dozens of people at a time. So certainly if the Iranians manage to just inspire some domestic, dissatisfied, unhappy young male, they could buy an assault rifle, walk onto Carlisle Barracks before the guard staff could round them up, and shoot lieutenant colonels and colonels. Now, that sort of small-scale terrorism by domestic lone wolves that are not infiltrated into the United States from Iran, but are here already and simply decide they want to take action against the U.S. government, can happen. Domestic terrorism is more lethal to Americans than international terrorism. Now, the majority of domestic terrorism in the United States since 2001 has not been from the Islamist left, it's been from the domestic right. It's mostly been anti-ecological terrorists or people who believe that the government is a conspiracy. Those are the folks who've been doing most of the terrorism killing in the United States since 2001. But there are exceptions. And it could happen again, but I doubt that it's enough to, if you're thinking about this from the standpoint of the Iranian government and its objectives, I doubt they believe that they can threaten enough pain this way to cause the United States to stand down and allow them to get a nuclear weapon without further airstrikes, because I don't think they think the tactic is lethal enough. Yes, and then yes.
Hold on a second. Yep, he's got it.
Okay. The other thing was, okay, I have a kind of multiple question.
Sure.
First of all, what Iran or its proxies could do is hack. Everybody can hack. North Koreans hack. Russians hack. Now, the hacking would not obviously end up in a nuclear weapon, but you would be able, with hacking, to get into water systems, dams, electrical infrastructure. That's probably a more potential problem because it's much harder to find, because the hackers are everywhere. And that's one problem, okay? My second issue is, now I usually don't do this, frankly, but I frankly think that we, now I don't usually agree with Trump, frankly, because I think he's a narcissistic 12-year-old. But having said that, at this particular time, we have been at war in one way or another with Iran since 1979, and we will continue to be. And that's why I would say that we should have regime change. Now, will that be successful? Well, over time, maybe, because we've had major protests that have always been put down by incredibly lethal force, with women, children, and through their Republican Guard. It's actually a better possibility to have regime change in this particular case, because otherwise the pot will continue to boil. I know that's complicated too.
Well, let me address the two parts separately. We'll start with the second part in regime change and what does it really mean, and then we'll go to the first part in hacking and cyber war as a potential Iranian technique. So with respect to regime change, I would probably disagree with you about war since 1979, just because certainly we've had tensions with Iran since 1979. Usually the profession has a threshold for war of a certain number of battle deaths that we haven't met with Iran, but either way, there's clearly been a great deal of tension. Would regime change that? Would it make for a better outcome than we've had or a worse outcome than we've had? And the problem is, what would replace the current theocracy if we got regime change? Now, usually what we've seen is where we get regime change without a very heavy outside presence to try and shape the government that will follow. This has gotten the pejorative label of nation building these days, but there's some record of success in it. We nation built successfully in post-World War II Germany and Japan, but after massive investments of effort. Where we've had regime change without a massive investment of effort, the result has often looked like Libya, for example, where there's been chronic, ongoing civil war for over a decade after Gaddafi and the Libyan government collapsed and then wasn't replaced with anything else except warlordism. So my guess is that if we did change, if we toppled the theocracy in Tehran, the result would probably be chronic civil warfare among factions that are unable to monopolize violence. Now, again, lots of Israelis think that's better and they would prefer it. From the standpoint of the United States, personally, I don't think it's better. Just initially from the standpoint of a kind of a realpolitik American view, and then in a moment from the perspective of a Christian view. From a realpolitik view, Iran was almost certainly not going to attack the domestic United States, even if it got nuclear weapons, as long as the mullahs are in control. Because their primary objective is regime preservation. A direct attack on the continental United States would be a recipe for violent regime change. So they don't have an incentive to do it. And they hadn't done it. I mean, the number of American fatalities at Iranian hands since 1979 is very, very small. My own view is that the Israelis exaggerate the Iranian threat, but it's much more proximate physically to them than it is to us. So just in terms of cold-eyed realpolitik, Iranians keeping things on a low simmer is horrible for Iranians. It depresses economic growth. It sacrifices national wealth to military programs that don't do anybody any good. It suppresses political expression. It does all sorts of horrible things for Iranians. But from the United States perspective, I mean, it's not killing a lot of Americans. I think we could continue to live with it indefinitely. But then, if we look at this not through a realpolitik lens, but through a Christian lens, where I don't think God cares whose passport people carry. Right? I mean, God has no preference for Americans over Iranians or Israelis over Iraqis or anybody else. An American policy of toppling a government and not replacing it with a stable alternative, just letting the place collapse into chronic warfare for the average civil war of this kind lasts 11 years. I mean, I'm not sure I could support the scale of suffering we would be responsible for if we were the ones who catalyzed the fall of the regime. And if we wanted to avert that human suffering in response to God's will, the scale of investment we would require would be enormous. I mean, Iran is a huge country. Bigger, higher population, more geographically diverse than Iraq or Afghanistan, and even further from the United States. So anyway, for my view, regime change in Iran solves a problem that isn't very severe by creating a problem that might for Americans be worse, and I think from a Christian perspective is almost certainly worse. So I'm not in favor of regime change as an objective. I would prefer that Iran democratize peacefully, and that it get the government that a significant fraction of its citizens actually want. And I'm in favor of the United States supporting that diplomatically and economically. But I'm not in favor of our killing people in order to create a regime change that, in my view, if it's done that way, right, if it's not a legitimate action of the Iranian people to change their own government, but it's an outside intervention to forcibly change a government whose own citizens didn't do it, I think it leads to suffering afterwards on a scale that I wouldn't support. That brings us to the issue of cyber retaliation by Iran. And I suspect they're hard at work in trying to figure out the techniques to do that. But it's not an ideal tool for what they're after at the moment. Cyber attacks are classically not good coercive tools. What the Iranians want right now is coercion. What they want to do is they want to say to the Americans, if you attack us again, then we will shut down the water system, electrical power throughout the eastern United States, and we'll crash the New York Stock Exchange. But if you don't attack us, then we won't do those things. And the trouble there is if they threaten us with it, we will immediately duplicate every IT system involved and take massive precautions to keep their hackers out. So hacking is very rarely done successfully for coercive purposes because coercion requires that you explicitly threaten the target first before you act, and that alerts the target and makes it significantly more difficult for hackers to get into the systems they're trying to get into. What hacking is really good at is stealing stuff. Right? It's terrific for transferring resources to an outside party. It's terrific for spying on people. Once you surreptitiously get access to their computer system, you can watch everything they're doing. It's part of how you can steal stuff, is you can steal people's passwords, credit card numbers, so on and so forth. But it's very rarely, if ever, to date been employed for coercive purposes because of the problem in alerting the target that goes along with its use for coercion. Now, if the Iranians simply wanted to hurt Americans for the sake of hurting Americans, right? If they're going to attack us because they hate us, not because they're trying to change our behavior, then in principle, yeah, they could probably hack into a variety of American information systems and hurt a bunch of Americans that way. Heaven knows there have been plenty of cyber incursions into all sorts of American information systems that have hurt all sorts of Americans for a generation. And the Iranians could do that too. But usually you assume that states are using force instrumentally to get some sort of political goal. And cyber, by contrast with airstrikes, is very hard to use that way. It's usually much easier to threaten. For example, for Israel to say, if you guys pursue a nuclear weapon, we will attack you again and destroy it. Because the Iranians have shown they can't do anything about that. Right? So the threat doesn't render itself non-viable. Cyber can accomplish that. It can render its own threat non-viable by alerting its target, if you're using it coercively. Where was there
another question? I'm going to ask you to go down to the mic, and that will allow Steve to be at the front of the room, and the folks in the front aren't turning and twisting their bodies to see him.
Sorry about that.
No, it's okay. It's okay. It's the teacher I knew wanting to talk face-to-face with the people that ask the question.
Aged ears.
I just wanted to know, with remaining hostages, Israeli hostages in Gaza, is that part of Israel's tactic or strategy? Where is that in all this?
Yeah, so Hamas took, we believe, 251 hostages. It's believed that something like 50 of them remain in Gaza, of whom more than half are probably dead. But there are a couple of dozen believed to be living hostages still in Gaza. And one of the biggest controversies in Israel ever since October 7 has been, should the purpose of military action be to destroy Hamas or to get the hostages back? Because to get the hostages back, you have to coerce Hamas into making a decision to release them. That means Hamas has to survive. So what's left of the Israeli left, politically, has typically been saying we should prioritize hostage return over Hamas destruction. Netanyahu and the Israeli right have said the opposite. Their argument is, if we leave Hamas alive, these hostages may come back, but Hamas will just take more of them in the future and we'll end up worse off in the end anyway. So we should prioritize the destruction of Hamas and hope that we get back as many living hostages as we can, but we're not going to prioritize it. But that has been controversial in Israel and remains so. I mean, there's not much left of the left domestically in Israel. Politically, the Israeli left is pretty much dead electorally. But it's most vocal on this issue of hostage return. Now, there have been regular murmurs of ceasefire negotiations between Hamas and the Israelis for years, since October 7. At the moment, there's another murmur going on. And part of the talk that's been in the newspapers for the last 48 hours or so has been that some people believe that Hamas might be prepared to release the remaining 50-ish in exchange for various promises from the Israelis. That's been talked about many times before, and it's never happened. So I'm not going to bet my mortgage that it happens this time. Maybe it will, and that would be great. And we could talk more about the mechanics of the ongoing ceasefire negotiations if people like. But you know, the hostages remain. If there's no deal, they're probably going to stay there for a long time. There was one last question.
I was wondering about Syria and how it figures into this whole boiling pot.
Yeah, so the Ba'athist Syrian government had long been an existential opponent of Israel and had been an ally of the Iranians, especially after the Arab Spring uprisings threatened the viability of the Assad government in Syria. So there'd been this long civil war in which mostly Sunni Muslim opponents to the Alawite Muslim government, the Assad government, had been fighting it out. It looked like the rebels were going to topple the regime, and then the Iranians and the Russians intervened in the war to sustain Assad. And Assad looked like he had won the war and defeated the insurgency. It's much more complicated than this, but I'm kind of skating over the surface. The Turks are involved, the Kurds are involved, the Americans are involved, there are all sorts of other actors. But primarily, you had an Assad regime backed by the Iranians and the Russians against a Sunni Islamist resistance backed by others, including the Saudis and the Turks, and at some level us. And it looked like Assad had won that war. Then Russia invaded Ukraine. And when Russia invaded Ukraine, the scale of assistance the Russian government was providing to Assad plummeted because the Russians needed every last cartridge for dealing with the Ukrainians. And then you had the October 7 attacks, and the Iranians started having to divert resources to deal with, to support Hezbollah and the Yemenis. And the result of that was that support for the Assad government from outside plummeted. The Saudis and the Turks and others saw opportunity, ramped up their funding of the rebel resistance, and it marched on Damascus and toppled the Assad government. When that happened, a lot of us were expecting chronic civil warfare in Syria. Instead, so far, it hasn't happened. The rebel government that toppled Assad appears to be trying to monopolize violence around the country and to prevent civil war by attempting to provide something like representative pluralist government. For a while, it looked like the Israelis were going to prevent that from succeeding. So early on, after the Assad government fell, the Israel Defense Force invaded the part of Syria closest to Israel to establish a security zone, and were using airstrikes to destroy the remaining arsenal of the old Assad government before the new rebel regime could take it over. And people like me were looking at this and saying, the new government needs those arms, because that's how they're going to attain a monopoly of force, prevent a civil war from breaking out. So it looked like the Israelis were going to drive a wedge into Syria and prevent stabilization for fear that the end result of it might be a strong Syria that could eventually threaten Israel. Israel decided instead to spend its time and its effort on Hezbollah and the Iranians. And so the result is, so far at least, the Syrian government is getting some running room without a lot of foreign interference to try and establish a monopoly of force in something that looks like relatively pluralist government. given their early progress in this, the West has mostly revoked the sanctions that were in effect against the old Syrian government under Assad in the hope that we can kickstart some degree of economic reconstruction in Syria to give the average Syrian a stake in the new government. Now, there's still quite a bit of debate about the new government and its intentions. Many of my Israeli friends are convinced that this new government will eventually be anti-Israeli, and they're viewing this with wariness and skepticism, but at least they're not using force against it at this point. Others are more optimistic and hopeful. It's early days, and we don't know. But so far, at least, if one wanted to construct an optimistic story about the Mideast in the next 5 to 10 years, right, that optimistic story would be Syria might develop into a responsible, respectable state. Who knows? Maybe Hamas will be kicked out of Gaza and replaced with a Palestinian Authority that's reformed and capable of governing. Perhaps the Lebanese government will establish control over South Lebanon, south of the Litani, and perhaps Iran will be, the current Iranian regime will be replaced with a government that is pluralistic and democratic rather than chaotic and violent. I mean, for better or worse, it's a very fluid region at the moment in ways that it hasn't been, since the U.S. invaded Iraq, at least. Now, there are just as many ways in which things could go badly. But, I mean, you could make a good argument that Syria is the most promising part of the whole region right now, ironically enough. I mean, after all the suffering and all the destruction in that civil war, there's a moment of opportunity in Syria now where they've got some running room and the West is supporting them economically. Let's hope it moves forward.
My question kind of relates to, I think, what you were just transitioning into. So the magic question, $1 million question, where do you see things in 15 years or so? What's your biggest hope, but what's your most significant concern?
Well, I mean, I tend to be a pessimist in these talks, right? So the pessimistic story is always easier to tell. So it's easy enough to imagine Iran getting a nuclear weapon covertly, and that leading to a nuclear war in the region. So there's nothing we see at the moment that enables you to rule that out as a possibility, right? The Israeli policy and the Trump administration policy has been high payoff, high risk. They've gone to war to take a latent nuclear power and denuclearize it, but it could cause it to go nuclear. I mean, I'm risk averse enough that I would not have chosen that way. But Netanyahu and Trump have a different attitude towards this than I would. So the pessimistic prognosis, right, is you get a nuclear war, which could involve the United States, right? I mean, you can make an argument that if the Iranians get a nuclear weapon, it would be much easier to employ it against the domestic United States than against Israel. Israel has very high walls up around it. The United States trades with the world and has a much higher volume of commercial shipping into and out of its ports. I mean, missiles are a very difficult delivery system for the Iranians. They're subject to interception at rates that, as we've observed, are very high. Putting something in a shipping container and sailing into a port is probably the most viable delivery means for them, and it's easier to do that covertly into the United States than it is into Israel. So that's what the worst case looks like. The best case would be something like, let's take the best case, right? We get a stable, viable regime change that looks more like the positive story in Syria and less like the experience in Lebanon and elsewhere. And a democratic status quo power in Tehran then enables the rest of the region to demilitarize because it's mostly been afraid of the Iranians. It allows the Israelis to stand down. It allows Gaza to develop. Right? The view of the Israeli right has long been, if you can just get this government in Tehran out of the way, all these other good things flow from that. So that would be the best possible outcome, is democratization in Tehran leads to a radical downgrading of all the other conflicts in the region and a substantial reduction in military effort and violence. Let God's will be done. The intermediate case, which is maybe likelier than either of those two, is that the Iranian regime eventually does fall, but it's replaced with chaos. And you get something that looks a lot like Libya, and that grinds on for a decade or more, and creates hard to anticipate political dynamics elsewhere in the region. Now, one other related scenario that people like David Ignatius are fascinated with right now is that the weakening of Iran enables Iran to be isolated in the rest of the region to cooperate and develop economically. Ignatius's argument is that the Saudis and the Emiratis and others will be willing to normalize with an Israel that they see as this 900-pound gorilla that can't be stopped militarily, so we don't want them to come after us, so we'll normalize our relations with them. The other possibility, which I think is more likely, is that the Saudis will say, we were willing to normalize with people we hate because we were afraid of Iran. Iran doesn't look like any threat at the moment. So why do I have to normalize with the Israelis? If I normalize with the Israelis, given the way they've been treating the Palestinians in Gaza, I'll end up with a popular uprising in Riyadh. So, I think the Ignatius scenario strikes me as unlikely, but that's a range of possibilities anyway that might emerge from all this.
How does that change things, if at all?
Not very much, because the Ayatollah is the product of a larger theocracy that the institutional foundation for which would survive his death. It's a system that's designed to enable succession. So unless the Israelis kill all of them, right, there will be a successor. The theocracy's view of the purpose of the state and the threats to the state is very much the same as Khomeini's. So it probably wouldn't change that much. That's part of the reason why I tend not to be sympathetic to the Israeli emphasis on assassinating individuals. I think it creates a weaker opponent, but it very rarely changes the opponent's policies because there will be a successor who will step in, and the successor will usually find cooperation with you too unpalatable.
I have a question from Thursday Morning Bible Study folks. Lori Liebert, who watches with us online, and she's watching today from New York. And her question is a fundamental question to Dr. Biddle, is the why this region has always been a boiling pot, religion, culture, geography? She left it open-ended.
The causes of war, as you might imagine, different theoretical perspectives in the study of international relations give rise to different answers to that question. So academic realists would look at this and say, the problem is the balance of power in the region. That you've got either, depending on what flavor of realist you're talking about, you've either got a prospective Iranian hegemon that others are worried about, and therefore they align against them, and therefore you get warfare, Or some realists would argue the problem is there isn't a hegemon, and therefore nobody knows what the balance of power is, and therefore there's a reason for warfare. Some international relations theorists would argue that the issue is individuals, that you've got people in power in Tehran who are expansionist, non-status quo, greedy actors and want more and more power for Iran. And that individual theory of international politics says when you get individuals who are aggressive, you get war. When you get individuals who are not aggressive, you don't. Others would argue that the problem is the nature of the governments, not individuals. That democracies don't go to war with each other, but democracies and autocracies frequently go to war with each other. And the problem with the Middle East is you've got lots of autocracies and one democracy. And that gives rise to conditions that tend to promote warfare. Most political scientists would not say that religion, conventionally understood, is the root of this problem. Most political scientists would look at this and say what you've got is self-interested actors who are either pursuing self-defense, that's the way I've tended to view the region, right? As we've talked about this, I tend to frame the problem as the Iranians want regime preservation. The problem is they've come to power in a way that creates a legitimacy crisis. That's the root cause of all these other problems, is somebody who wants self-preservation but can only do it by picking fights externally creates a problem of chronic warfare. If you want to argue that religion is the reason, and it's not just a secondary factor, but it's the underlying cause, it gets you into what I think is bad theology about Islam and or bad theology about Judaism or Christianity. Right? There is an argument that's popular in some parts of the American political conversation that Islam is an intrinsically aggressive religion, and the reason you've got fighting in the Middle East is because there are too many Muslims in the Middle East. And I think that's an unsound reading of the Quran, and I think that's an unsound claim about the practice of Islam in these societies. It's a view one sometimes encounters in the US, but I think it's a weaker claim to validity than the other possibilities I was sketching a moment ago, and especially the argument that usurpist regimes have legitimacy problems that they tend to externalize in international conflict. And too many of these regimes are usurpist. That goes for the Iranians. It also went for Saddam's Iraq. It went for Abbas's Syria. It went for the Egyptian government. So I tend to think what people do is they attach religion to an agenda that is not, in this region for this purpose, they attach religion to an agenda that is not fundamentally theological, but is political in nature, and dress it up with a theological overlay. So I don't think it's causal. I think it's a symptom and not a cause.
Any other questions for Steve? Then I'm going to turn this over to Mark, and he'll end for us. But I guess I have one question for you, in that, as we, the general Joe Schmo, listening to the news, what would you give as suggestions just to how we should, when we hear stuff, how do we handle it? How do we know, what we should know and what isn't truth? And what would you give us as a suggestion? Because you obviously know so much more than most of us in the room, and we really do appreciate you being here. But how do we know what to do? How do we take it?
Yeah, I think it's important for all of us to develop an understanding of what sources are reliable and which sources aren't, and to be willing to do some degree of cross-checking and critical thinking when we evaluate what sources are telling us. So this is easier for me because I do this for a living and I have lots of time to invest in it, and I understand that. But I can tell you there are sources that I absolutely do not believe and others that I do. I do not find credible Breitbart or The Nation. Breitbart being progressive right, The Nation being progressive left. I've had enough experience with what they say to conclude that they're both playing fast and loose with the facts, and they're both putting an ideological agenda ahead of objective validity. Outlets that I do think are more credible include right-leaning, the Wall Street Journal, the news part of it rather than the opinion part of it, the Financial Times, The Economist. More left-leaning, the New York Times is not as good as it once was, but I'd say they're a world better than Breitbart and Fox. The Washington Post used to be a lot better than it is, but it's still better than Breitbart or Fox. NPR would be pretty high on the list. But that said, even the New York Times, NPR, the Financial Times, and the Washington Post get it wrong too. Right? So in areas that I work on a lot, Ukraine, Afghanistan, Iraq, issues like that, I've observed plenty of stories that I didn't think were straight down the middle at all of these outlets. I just think the success rate is significantly higher for the lamestream media, right? The places like the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times than places like One America or Breitbart or Fox or The Nation or BuzzFeed or and if I don't get news through social media, I'm personally a social media Luddite, but if I were receiving news that way, I'd spend a lot of time, I'd pay careful attention to what the origination was. Where did the story that's coming into my news feed start? Did it start at One America News, or did it start at The Nation? And if so, the fact that Facebook is bringing it to my attention should not cause me to actually pay any attention to it. And I'd be very careful about the fact that social media algorithms are designed to make your feed more extreme than what it would be otherwise. Among the reasons why I don't read news through social media is I know the algorithm is designed to make what I see more incendiary over time. Whereas if I dispense with that and I just go straight to the Wall Street Journal, I'm not getting that tendency over time for an algorithm to be sending me stuff that's designed to keep me angry. So I would argue, don't take your news through social media. Go straight to sources. Go straight to sources that are mainstream, middle of the road, and that you have some reason to think are right more often than they're wrong. And then when you read something, ask, is this consistent with other things I've seen or not? And if it's not, why isn't it? How is this article sourced? Are all of the sources anonymous? Are some of the sources named but are representatives of ideologically oriented organizations that clearly have a stake in this thing? So anyway, that's kind of my general advice, and I know that I'm recommending a degree of investment in news consumption that most people don't have a lot of time for, and I'm sympathetic to that problem. But I think to the extent that you don't do it, you're at risk of being led into increasingly extreme views by the powers of algorithms.
Well, we want to thank the doctor for...
Not the useful kind.
Well, we need all kinds. And though it probably created a lot of questions and got our hearts beating a little faster, it's good to know that there's someone who is, as you said, you deal with this all the time, which is a gift. As we want to thank you. Yeah.
You're very welcome.
We thank you, God, for this time. And as we leave, remember, live our lives as free people, and don't use that freedom as a pretense for evil. Honor everyone. Love your brothers and sisters in Christ, and love God. Go now in peace. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for coming.